Constitution talk about. So it is clear to me that Jefferson meant it when he said it. Jefferson, of course, one of the grandfathers, along with Madison, of the construct of religious freedom in our country for believers and non-believers, described this in a letter to the Danbury Baptists as a wall of separation between church and state, mirroring, some historians think, Roger Williams, the great advocate for religious freedom, who used to talk about a separation between the state, and he called it a hedge of separation between the wilderness of the world and the power of the church. So this is a phrase that was actually present in colonial times in a slightly modified form, and is very much a part of the principles and history of our country.
Speaking of founding fathers, how do you think they would react to a lot of the issues that we see unfolding in that arena today, the arena of civil liberties and government funding of faith-based organizations and so on?
Yeah, I think the founding fathers, after they had picked themselves up after fainting, for the kinds of outlandish things the president says and does, and John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, says and does, they would say, listen, we founded this country on the basis that everyone is equal, that you don't have to be religious, that you don't have to take oaths of office, that you don't have religious ceremonies, as John Ashcroft does, prayer sessions in his office for his employees every morning. I think they'd say, take that to a Starbucks. Don't use government property, and don't put people who don't share the religious beliefs of John Ashcroft feeling uncomfortable if they don't attend his religious services every morning. So I think they'd be deeply shocked when the President of the United States has a faith-based initiative, government-funded religion of the ministries and missions of churches, and then actually gives a speech, as he did recently, Ed, in which he said, we're going to give money to fund programs that save Americans one soul at a time. Sorry, but the President of the United States is not our theologian-in-chief. He is the commander-in-chief. He's the president, the chief executive. We didn't elect him to be our pastor, even if we're religious.
Right, and of course in his State of the Union address just recently given, he called for $300 million to be spent on faith-based rehabilitation for people coming out of the prison systems. Does this mean, what I should say is, does he even have the slightest comprehension of what our Constitution is all about when he calls for things like this?
I honestly don't think that President Bush actually knows what the separation of church and state means. I don't think he has the construction. If the speechwriters didn't occasionally throw it into a speech, I don't think he'd ever mention it at all. This idea of giving hundreds of millions of dollars to faith-based organizations, and now even faith-based prisons. Of course, Floridians know that you now have an entirely faith-based prison in Lawton here in Florida, and it's no more constitutionally permissible to set up a faith-based prison than it would be to set up a faith-based housing project or a faith-based post office. And of course, we have actually asked the state of Florida to turn over a vast number of documents to try to find out if Florida's taxpayers are basically being forced to put money in the collection plate for someone else's religious conversion. Jeb Bush, along with, of course, his brother, frequently talk about salvation coming only from Jesus Christ, and of course they have every right as Americans to believe it, but as public officials they certainly do not have any right to ask the rest of us, believers or not, to pay for their religious ideas.
In case you've just joined us, I'm Ed Golly at the Atheist Forum, and we're talking today with Barry Lynn, Executive Director of an organization called the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, headquartered in Washington, D.C. We're talking about the erosion of civil liberties in America as a result of various things such as the Patriot Act and other concerns that have evolved with this particular administration. Taking a sort of a religious bent and handing our tax dollars over to religious organizations, faith-based initiatives, and so on. Barry?
You know, one of the things that happens literally every day, there is a major church-state issue that arises someplace in the country, and we have a staff, a growing staff of over 30 people now in Washington who work on and help our chapters, of which we have 11 actually in the state of Florida, to get involved at the local level and the national level on these important issues. We were one of the organizations that represented several of the attorneys in Alabama who challenged the placement of that 2.5-ton granite monument by Judge Roy Moore. I should correct that, former Judge Moore, because he has been suspended, and frankly, I hope he is disbarred from the continued practice of law in the state of Alabama. He had absolute contempt for the Constitution. He took this 2.5-ton monument, put it in the judicial building as Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, and then defied a federal court order to have it removed. Petty tyrants, along with mighty ones, really need to be told the truth about the Constitution. Eventually, of course, that monument was removed. The irony of this, and this is one of the things that I think is an embarrassment, frankly, to those of us who are believers. There's something like 245 churches in the near proximity to the courthouse that contained this 2.5-ton monument. Not a one of them said, well, why don't you put it on public display here on our front lawn? Because rather than battle about the display of religious icons and statements on public spaces, why don't those organizations set up to promote the faith, why don't they just promote it in their own way on their own private property? It really is an embarrassment.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Judge Moore, it seems to me one of the most dangerous things that a president can do is to appoint judges to the federal bench and to the Supreme Court that are going to rule against the protections that we have in the Constitution. Let me ask you this. You think Judge Moore could ever find a place on the Supreme Court?
You know, I've got to tell you, I do have some optimistic streaks, and ultimately I think as bad as these times are, that in the long run, justice is going to prevail. And justice means increased awareness of the individual rights of people. You have some rough spots, and we have had them throughout American history. Judges are definitely a problem. I mean, many of the people who are being appointed by this president are people who have a limited amount of respect for the United States Constitution, but they're largely unknown. 98 to 99 actually % of the judges that have been proposed have already been confirmed by the Senate. A couple of them have been the subject of filibusters. More should be. The Attorney General of Alabama, who by the way is not a hero, it took him so long, to straddle the fence on what he was actually going to say about the Judge Moore case. I thought his pants might split, and he's not a hero, but now he's being suggested for a federal appeals court in one of the circuits in the country that's been most engaged in civil rights litigation over the past few decades. He should not be confirmed. Judge Janice Rogers Brown, another person who is a complete conservative extremist, who doesn't even know that the Bill of Rights necessarily should apply to the states, even though, of course, we passed the 14th Amendment after the Civil War to do that, and even, I think, Judge Scalia believes that, but she doesn't. I don't think that these people should be on the bench, the federal judiciary, and in fact I think it's perfectly fine for them to be filibustered as a matter of principle.
I want to talk a little about school vouchers. I know that you're familiar with the issue here in Florida, but before we get to that, just a few days ago the U.S. Senate approved the country's first federally funded educational voucher program in Washington, D.C., which will enable some poor public school students in the District of Columbia to attend private schools. Now, with that decision, is this beginning to pave the way for national acceptance of school vouchers in all 50 states?
Interestingly, public opinion polls show less support now than ever for school vouchers, because as people start to look at the evidence from places like Florida, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Cleveland, Ohio, places that have had these programs for a number of years, they find out not only does it end up diverting tax dollars into the coffers of religious schools and away from public schools, but it doesn't even work. The program does not make education better for the students who take the vouchers. In fact, in some areas in Cleveland, after extensive study, voucher students, that is students who left the public school and go to private schools, are doing worse than their counterparts in the public schools. If you want to do something for education, we've got to fully fund public education. And divesting public schools of some of their resources and converting it into dollars for private religious schools is bad constitutionally. And frankly, a lot of state constitutions are clearer than the federal Constitution about this. And that's why, even though the United States Supreme Court, in a very controversial decision by a 5-4 margin, upheld the constitutionality, the permissibility of vouchers under some circumstances, virtually no states have passed new voucher programs, and both the state of Florida and the state of Colorado, relying on state constitutional provisions, have turned thumbs down to voucher programs in those two states. So the public is not enthralled with this. This is an ideological snake oil solution to the real needs of school children. If we want to compete with countries around the world in the future and with the future of our kids, we better reform public schools, not try to tear them down by sending a fraction of those students into voucherized, predominantly religious schools.
But then how would you respond to a tax-paying parent's argument that might sound something like this? I pay taxes to support the schools. Why shouldn't I have the freedom to direct that money to the school of my choice for my child?
You know, and it's an argument I do hear a lot. The truth of the matter is, though, in the United States, most public schools are paid for not by the parents of any student. In other words, most of the money that goes into the school system in most places, say here in Florida, is from people who have no children, people who have no children in schools, grandparents. I mean, these are not funded one-on-one on the basis of if you have a child of school age, you pay the taxes. You pay only a fraction of it. We don't have a system where if you don't like something, you just don't have to pay for it. In other words, there are plenty of people who don't like the war in Iraq. That doesn't mean they can't pay their taxes because some fraction of it might be used for that purpose. I think what America really needs is a guarantee, and we certainly haven't seen it, not with this phony No Child Left Behind Act, which is mainly an excuse for no child being allowed to exist in the country untested any time that's appropriate for all the educational testing companies. But we need a real commitment to divert whatever number of dollars are necessary to make sure that every child in America gets a quality public education. If you want a private education, you're certainly entitled under our Constitution to go to a private school. You are not entitled to ask for the government, however, to subsidize that private school. If you don't like the police department in town, I may get in trouble here because I don't know the local laws in Florida, but most states, you can go out and buy a gun. If you think that will protect yourself, that doesn't mean the government has to provide you with that extra protection.
I have a little trouble understanding something that's going on here in Florida. Maybe you can help me with it. As you know, we started the voucher program in '99. It was immediately challenged in court, and the judge found that the Constitution of our state prohibits the expenditure of any public funds for religious purposes. Therefore, he concluded that the voucher program was unconstitutional. It didn't stop. The governor, instead of, well, what I think would have been a gesture of respect for the law and the judiciary, decided to not only keep the program going but expand it pending the appeals and overturning it or just appealing it. Shouldn't he have gone the other way with that and stopped the program until it was found constitutional?
You know, I think the governors and politicians that buy into any program, including something like vouchers, tend to want to preserve the fiction that they could never possibly make a mistake. As a consequence, they're going to keep the program even if we should, under, shall we say, a test of rationality, you stop the program and see what happens in the later decisions of the court. But many politicians don't do that, and of course the courts are kind of creaky here and everywhere else. They operate slowly. There's sometimes the sentiment that, well, you know, parents or students have built up some expectation that they now have a voucher and they want to be able to keep it, so we'll let them have it until we see how this works through the court system. But I think that is doing business backward. Of course, in Florida, so many people who initially got vouchers found that the private schools were not a fit for their children, that within about 2 months of starting the program, something like a quarter of the students actually dropped out of those private schools for which they had gotten a subsidy and went back, of course, guess where? To the public schools, which do, of course, have a requirement constitutionally to take all comers, to take all kids who need and who certainly benefit from an education.
Politics in America seems to follow sort of a swinging pendulum agenda. The right wing gets in power and then the left wing gets in power, and it seems to move back and forth. My concern is some of these issues that are actually causing the erosion of our civil liberties, or the government support of religion, being entrenched in a way that we can't reverse out of that, such as when Reagan appointed an ambassador to the Vatican. That ambassadorship has never been dissolved.
That's right.
When a Democratic president came in power. What do you see as the future of some of these different issues that are coming into play now on the American agenda as being difficult or impossible to reverse down the road?
You know, it's certainly going to be difficult to change some of what could happen if you had a judiciary that, for example, did overturn Roe versus Wade. What would happen? Well, of course, then you'd have to go back to the states and state by state battle to preserve the right of privacy, the right of women to make reproductive choices. You'd go back to a fundamental, though, Ed, and I do believe this. You know, laws are laws. They're important. Decisions of courts are vitally important. But ultimately, these principles, like equal justice under law or privacy or freedom of religion, reside in the hearts of people. And when it dies there, then we are in genuine trouble. We're in a little trouble, of course, if Congress passes bad laws, if those laws are upheld